You're listening to The Frequency of Laughter, a Radio 4 podcast about radio comedy presented by me, Grace Dent. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to The Frequency of Laughter, a show about the history of radio comedy. I'm Grace Dent, and this week we're looking in particular at the early 90s. So I'm joined by two people who were taking their first steps in radio together at this time, albeit from slightly different sides of the microphone. Richard Herring wrote on Week Ending and On the Hour before being made a radio comedy staff writer, and then writing and performing in Lionel Nimrod's Inexplicable World with his double act partner Stuart Lee, going on to make series such as Lee and Herring's Fist of Fun and the simply titled Lee and Herring. My other guest, Sarah Smith, was the producer of Lionel Nimrod and Fist of Fun, as well as The League of Gentlemen on radio and television, before moving into film, where most recently she set up the Locksmith animation studio. During the show, you'll be hearing excerpts from the programmes we're talking about, as well as contributions from some other people who were around at the time. But I started by asking Richard if he'd been a fan of radio comedy while growing up.
As a student, I really listened to, I love Just a Minute and Kenneth Williams, especially on Just a Minute. So there was that heritage and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and things like that. I don't massively remember lots of the shows that I was listening to, but I was listening to those, some quite good, some quite awful sketch shows.
Did you ever get to appear on Just a Minute?
I did, yeah. Well, only recently, yeah. So I've started. So that's an amazing thing for me because I'm very, very excited about it.
Are you any good?
I'm getting quite good at it now. Yeah, it's really hard. It's really, really hard. But the last couple I've had, it's about having fun on it, and I just love the way Kenneth Williams used to take it so seriously. There was a few we have.
Yeah, we have, yes. And you've cleverly got in with half a second to go, Richard.
I am very clever, thank you. It does rouse the envy of the...
Sarah, what were you listening to when you were a child?
I actually discovered it when I was at university. I kind of fell into comedy and radio by mistake. Definitely comedy by mistake. I didn't at all want a comedy career, but I left it a bit too late to join in all the kind of drama stuff that was going on at university, and the only thing in my first term, there was an audition for the Oxford Review. So I went along and I got a part in it, and then I just got sucked inextricably. I did a year with that, and then they said, oh, will you run it and direct it? So I did that. So I spent my entire time at university by mistake doing comedy. And when I was in my third year, other people in the house that I shared used to listen to the radio, and I started kind of, what are they listening to? And it turned out we were all closet Archers fans.
Do you see that as somewhat of a comedy, though, the Archers? Do you laugh?
Oh, yes, and they're furious when it's just that's pernicious nonsense. They wouldn't do that. But Armando Iannucci, I had done comedy with at university. He went off and got a job in BBC Radio, so I knew that it was a possibility. It was a thing a person could do. And a job came up in the department, and I thought, well, Armando got a job there, maybe I could. So I applied. And actually, just to pick up on Just a Minute, I think I went in all kind of iconoclastic about we have to change the world and make it all better, all of the radio programmes. But I was a massive secret Just a Minute fan. That was something that I listened to. And so I went to my boss at the time, and it was the one radio show. I said, I'd really like to do that.
Acknowledge his own mistakes, isn't it? Isn't that a noble thing to have done?
Now, look, you've got half an hour to go. Don't shoot everything at the beginning.
Oh,
no,
right.
Don't hold something back.
You're quite right. I should. Yes, you're right. I need sedation, really.
You do, really, yes.
They had way more established producers than me. I was like 24 and a girl. They didn't quite know what to hit them. It was the old crew at that time.
What was it like going in as a woman? They'd obviously met women in public, but how...
I didn't think about it until one day. And I was 24, But anyway, one of them making a comment because I was wearing quite short shorts and tights and boots. And I think there was some comment about, we've never had a producer in shorts before.
Let's start by talking about Week Ending, a topical sketch show which anyone could send stuff into, and it ran from 1970 to 1997, so we've been mentioning it quite a lot in this series. You two worked on it together in the early 90s. Was it actually any good?
Well, one of the big theses of my interview that got me the job was how it ought to be much better. And, you know, it really depended on who was producing it, because people had radically different taste, each producer, as Richard will attest, because, you know, you could be a writer and you could be getting 5 or 6 minutes, which meant you eat, basically, as a writer, or nothing, because the producer didn't like what you did. And it would swing completely. I was very fierce about wanting to shake it up. So it was one of the first things that they put me on as a trainee, which was when...
Yeah, well, that's April the 20th, 1990 was the first time I got a sketch on, and Sarah was responsible for putting that sketch on.
Richard, I absolutely love that you've brought a scrapbook.
I've got a scrapbook of my
all
sketches.
The things that were happening around this era.
It was about Lithuania, for some reason. Got it here.
It was hot then.
It's a slightly racist, xenophobic sketch about Lithuania. I don't know. I don't even know why Lithuania was in the news. It must have joined the EU or something. I don't know.
Must have been.
But
I cannot remember anything about it.
It wasn't. You know, it's just a slightly about them having potatoes as their national dish and that kind of thing. So.
I remember it vividly. You would have this meeting with your group of commissioned writers, and then you have the meeting that's open to everybody in the world. Some of whom are going to be the comedy geniuses of tomorrow. Some are cold and want to come into a room for a couple of hours. But in that group of kind of utterly eclectic kind of group of people, Rich and Stu was sat in the corner, and it just became this kind of weekly ritual where everyone waits to hear what they say, and I would be in fits of laughter, which of course makes you generally quite hated by all the people that aren't getting sketches on.
So are you saying that there was just very different styles depending on who was in the room?
Like a producer would do a run of 10 to 12 weeks. So over that 10 to 12 weeks, the programme would take on their comedy tone of what they select.
Armando did it shortly before we started working on the hour, and that's the reason we ended up working on the hour, because he liked us from the weekending meetings, but he tried to, as Sarah did as well, he tried to change it into something quite different. But the problem was, you know, a lot of the writers, jobbing writers, that was their job, and they had worked out the formula in order to how to get stuff on. I worked on it for over a year, and by the end I was going mad. I remember hiding in some crates in the writer's room. I got in a crate and I put another crate on top of me, and I refused to come out of the crates. And it was sort of a joke, but it was also, I thought, I am this close. So I didn't want to write another joke about John Majors being grey or eating peas or whatever they decided was the joke at the time. It took us about a year to get commissioned. I think we
wasn't allowed to give you. We were only allowed to give out about 12 minutes worth of money. So I basically had to axe some people before I could give you your minute.
Yeah, I think Sarah did it for 10 weeks, and we got little sketches on every week, so that was great. We were making £50 to £100 between the two of us. But then there was an 8-week period where Diane Messiahs produced it. I don't know what happened to her. And we got one quick sketch on in 8 weeks, and it was, you know, it's actually a disaster for you. And then Harry Thompson did it for 1 week, and it means you got 12 minutes of sketches on, which is absolutely unheard of. So we just basically wrote nearly the whole show, me and Stu, so it just would waver that way.
Diane Messiahs, senior BBC radio comedy producer, 1990 to 95. I had come to the BBC from a topical satirical show called News Review, which is still going. I'd been steeped in the tradition of topical satire, which is, as far as I'm concerned, to make a point about something. You're holding something up to ridicule, and you're making a political point by satirical means. My favourite writers were Barry Atkins, Michael Dines, Ian Pattinson. He does the chairman's script for I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue. John Random got quite a few things on. I commissioned him. He had come from News Review, the show I had previously worked with. There's more than one way of looking at satire, apparently. I think Richard and Stuart's way of looking at things, which I know Sarah Smith much admired, was a kind of not particularly wanting to make a point, but laughing at the situation and wanting to be sort of extend the gag about the situation and how silly it might be, or stupid, or worthless. Whereas I come from a tradition of wanting to make an actual political point. And I guess both are valid, except I'm right.
We should also talk about The Harpoon, a sort of audio comic strip, a bit like the Beano, which you produced, Sarah. How did that come about? Whose idea was it?
It came about, again, from people that I'd met on Weekending. Julian Dutton, I can't even think of the right adjective for Julian, and Pete Bainham, and I suggested they work together, which is actually the weirdest kind of oddball couple pairing, on an idea of Julian's, which was The Harpoon, because Julian loves sort of and lives in that kind of boy's own world. And it was massively fun to do, because it was really properly a sort of radio audio thing, with giant sessions creating sound effects, you know, like the sound of Birmingham falling out of a Christmas cracker. things like that, which is just like really, really technically fun to do. I heard some of it recently. For some reason, we were listening to it in reference to a thing I was doing, and it's really funny when you see your old work. It's only about 10 years later that you can see anything you did objectively, and I was like, that was great. That was what a funny show, and you it's such a long time before you can watch it as another person will watch it, isn't it?
I'm going to move on to talking about On the Hour.
The sound of a man sweeping up some change. And sweeping changes were top of the agenda when the delegates met today.
Richard, Mando invited you to write on the Hour. What are your memories of that? Was this a big boost to your career, do you think?
Looking back, it felt like it happened very quickly, but obviously we were there for a bit longer than I remember. But we were very lucky in that we worked with Armando on this weekending, and he liked it. And then I think it was like quite a few very successful things, like The Office. I think he'd gone away on a production course and made this little tape of spoof news show, and then he decided to kind of try and turn that into something else. So he basically put together this superhero team of amazing talent, and to make this show. So I think he was very good at spotting. He brought us and David Quantick and Stephen Wells, and
of course he'd heard Chris Morris on. So it was really a collaboration of Chris and Armando at heart, wasn't it? He'd heard Chris on. He was on LBC or something and he was, and Armando had been listening to him.
But even though in Chris's early stuff, some of it was great and some of it was a bit, because he wasn't a comedian, some of it was a bit comedic, like a little bit obvious, I thought. But Armando saw within him this amazing person.
I mean, I've read that recording of On the Hour was very haphazard. You'd have empty studios just being used on an ad hoc basis. Did you just feel like, God, is this going to turn into anything?
I think it was exciting to be part of it, but it didn't. We didn't know. I mean, it was ridiculous because it was basically the first major thing we did, and it became such a hit so quickly.
Yeah, it took off really fast. I mean,
really
within the first, as soon as it was going out, everyone knew that it was a really special thing.
This is Sports Desk. I'm Alan Partridge. Fishing news. The British angling competition. Latest score, anglers 532, fish 0.
How do you know you've got a hit?
You sort of, people were, there's ratings and there's less.
Talked about.
But
it was
you walk into a lift and someone would go, "Oh, you write for that on the Hour, that's amazing." So, and because people in radio loved it because it was about radio, so that was a great boost. So they straight away were talking about it. It was very, it was a little bit, and it was subtly anarchic underneath.
It's a strange thing how
Radio
things
4.
suddenly find their way. Because years later I did The League of Gentlemen on television, and within about 2 or 3 episodes of that going out, The Sun run a spread of all the characters from Royston Vasey.
I really think you're overreacting.
You're trying to turn me into a toad!
Yes.
Now, that wasn't even a piece of publicity that was placed. It just says that somehow something has hit a nerve and gone into the culture, and you felt that with On the Hour very early on. I seem to remember the news programmes picking up on it, like, Today programme or something. I don't remember exactly what happened, but that was the feeling, that everyone kind of was aware of it and that it was out in the media.
When I mentioned that about sneaking into studios and kind of grabbing people on an ad hoc basis, was that very typical of how he did things?
Armando just very much kind of follows his own creative lights and agenda. He doesn't follow the conventional production schedule. He's always has an end in mind and follows whatever means get you to the end, really.
Hello, I'm Armando Iannucci. Delighted to meet you. I do remember when I started as a radio producer, and I was a big radio comedy fan, and, I loved shows like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Radioactive. But when I arrived at radio, I was struck by how conventionally made things were, in that, 1 or 2 people went into a room and wrote something. They were probably men, and then they would come out with a script, and a producer would say, "Oh, very nice, very nice." I hated that phrase, nice. It kind of, in my head, that meant not funny. A studio would be booked for 2 or 3 hours, and actors would come in and read the words out on the page, and then sound effects would be added, or indeed played in live if someone had access to a horse or anything like that nearby. And then the thing would be, if it was a 30-minute programme, maybe they'd record 31 minutes to be on the safe side, and then cut things down. So On the Hour was a sort of reaction to that. It was a kind of experiment in looking at the possibility of doing what was fundamentally a sketch show, but seeing if we could do it a different way so it didn't sound like all those sketch shows. So it was about if we were recording a thing that was meant to sound like a news report, actually recording it like a news report, which is get 3 or 4 people to play the parts of different characters, give them the gist of the funny stuff that they're meant to say, but ask them to say it in their own words, have someone ask them questions. So you end up with recording about an hour and a half of these 3 interviews, and then, like any news editor, going away and cutting that hour and a half of stuff down to a report that lasted 3 or 4 minutes. It was asking, what is the style of the joke that we're trying to tell? Okay, would it be improved if we actually made it in that style? So if you wanted something to sound like Radio 1, do it in a Radio 1 studio where all the limiters and the faders and everything are all set at very different levels. And getting the lip mics that sports, football commentators and horse racing commentators use, the very, very close mic. They're always, you wonder why they sound like that. And it's because, you know, with the noise in the stadium, they have to have someone that shields their mouth, so they have to speak like that. Just getting those. Why don't we record like that rather than recording it and then having to change it in the sound mix later? It wasn't a manifesto for this is how all comedy should be done. It's just a thought that if the joke about this programme is it's talking utter nonsense but it sounds really real, then really to make the joke work you have to make it sound as really real as you really can.
Sarah, I'm going to move on and talk about producer choice. Suddenly every service the BBC provided was costed and you could choose whether to use in-house or independent suppliers. Did this change how you made programmes?
I'm sure that once or twice I quoted it in order to get away with something that I wanted to do. Like, I think when we did League of Gentlemen, I wanted to do it all up north, and so we went, producer choice, we'll use some different studios. But my main memory is that I once ended up in a room with a lot of people talking to John Burt, and he was, you know, I want to hear all of your views, which was fine as long as your views were pretty much like, this is all a great thing. Being me, I chipped up in the middle of it and going, well, you know, aren't we into a situation where we'll know the cost of everything and the value of nothing, and that by the time you've costed everything down to the last 10p stamp, you lose something that the BBC has, which you can't put a price on, which is people's sense of dedication and loyalty to something that is nothing to do with money. And that if you lose that along the way, you will have lost something that does actually have a financial value, but you can't cost it. I seem to remember the room went very, very quiet and then we just sort of moved on.
Do you think that anything got better because of producer choice?
No. Absolutely. Well, yes and no. I mean, oh, blimey, who cares? But no, I do care, because the sad thing is, if you just throw everything open to the market, what happened was a lot of good people leave and realise that they can charge themselves back to the BBC at bigger cost. So actually there's been massive inflation since then, because you still go after the best craft talent and you have no way of controlling the cost. On the other hand, you do break up the kind of slightly Jobsworth, this is how it is done, you have to buy us and there's nowhere else to go.
The talks continue at the World Summit on the Future.
I shall be there. Talk to me about Jonathan James Moore, head of radio comedy.
Jonathan was actually, he was a good thing. I think he walked a really good line between wanting to keep the whole thing in order and not let it all get in big trouble and keep everyone at Radio 4 and Radio 2 happy, but also wanting to allow the naughty children to have fun and do their thing. He backed Lionel Nimrod, He backed On the Hour, he let those things happen, and Fizz Fun he did. You know, he told me off when we did Weekending. We did Weekending the week that Margaret Thatcher resigned, and that's one of those kind of exciting things if you're on a satire show, because it happened on a Wednesday and we'd already planned the show. So on a Thursday it was like, OK, everyone, gloves off, you know, the biggest news thing ever. And we did a completely bonkers show, which I loved, ending up with a sketch. Margaret Thatcher basically going out to the park all day because she didn't want Dennis to know that she'd lost her job. It was really sweet and funny.
If I just come here every day until late at night, maybe Dennis will never need to know.
And then it ended with an old-fashioned song. And Jonathan came in, I feel a little that you've let us down in terms of the satirical content that could have been in that show, you know.
He's watch-keeping while you're sleeping. Big Ben saying goodnight.
But he was very open to new people, and that's an unusual combination. Yeah. And that's what exactly really kind of embodied the spirit of radio comedy. And if you look at what he presided over, you know, that was a rich era.
It feels like you're telling me about a time, though, where there was far less interference in your creativity. I mean, Richard, at the moment, you do podcasts where you have no creative interference.
Yeah.
Was that a decision because interference was beginning to get much, much worse, or much more strangling?
Yeah, it's just so. I mean, even then, it was really hard to get things on. It did take a long time to go from the pilot stage to getting on air, if you were lucky to get on air, and then you'll do it, and then they say, "Oh, you can't say this." I think the creative, that's terrible. If you're doing a radio show, you're relying on the producer. If you say something that's way out of line, to go, "Well, I'll nip that out." You want the freedom to be going, I'll just say whatever I want, and then you can decide what can go on the air. But if you're thinking, if you're self-censoring the whole time, I think just the ability. As it occurs to me, I just thought I could try and pitch this to the radio, but A, they'll take out all the stuff that's fun about it, and B, it'll take me 3 years to get it onto the air, even if it gets onto the air. And if I do it myself, I can put it on the air tomorrow.
You've brought back a memory, though, when you said that.
There you go again, so you're having a go at Somerset again. I'm actually surprised no one has written in over the series to complain.
Well, I'm not, really. Considering that they've only got one pen down there between them.
We did one of your series. We did it from the Edinburgh Festival because you were both up there. So we came and recorded it in a studio in Scotland, and it was virtually live. It was maybe a live show, actually, which was always nerve-wracking because you do rely on the I'll say whatever I like and that's your problem, which is when you're managing them live is a little bit anxious-making. We recorded something that was going to go in the second half. And I started trying to edit it, and this was on quarter-inch tape, while the recording was still going on, the broadcast was still going on, effectively, and I was trying to edit this thing out to make it acceptable to go in the second half past the news break, and the whole tape just started spooling off and getting in a mess, and I just turned to my poor broadcast assistant and went, "Can you sort that out?" and went back to running the live show, and she had about 6 minutes to try and do it. The worst thing about quarter-inch was that when you were up against it like that, your fingers sweat, and the damn tape won't stick together. It edits are breaking everywhere, and I was like, have you done it? I think so. So you were a slightly scary person to work with live.
Yes.
Lee and Herring's Fist of Fun.
Can I talk to you about Fist of Fun? Now, Fist of Fun was a Radio 1 show recorded at universities. Why?
It was because they were trying to reach out to...
it came from came from Jenny Stewart. There was a lady at Radio 4 whose job was to try and reach out to younger audiences, and one of her ideas was to do shows in universities, and so we kind of created this thing called The End of the Road Show as a sort of vehicle, and then we carried on.
Did the uni audience make a difference?
You know, it was nice because we were only just out of university. I suppose we were about 25 probably by then. So, you know, I think it made it sound, certainly to the people who were then listening back to it in here, in Broadcasting House, that we were appealing to the people they wanted us to appeal to.
Do you remember approaching people like Dale Winton and Geoffrey from Rainbow? Did they understand what they were getting into?
Well, it was really interesting with Dale Winton because, you know, we were living that student lifestyle, so we were watching Supermarket Sweep and Neighbours, trying to do some writing in the afternoon. And Dale Winton came on, and it was backstage, and he was like, I'm really depressed. I've made a big mistake doing this show and it's terrible. And we were going, no, it's great, it's brilliant. And he was like, I think my career's over. And he went out and he got this, I think it might be the first time he kind of realised actually this wasn't a terrible mistake being in Supermarket Sweep.
When you say terrible mistake and bad show, you mean Supermarket Sweep, not...
Supermarket Sweep. Well, both.
Didn't you ever stop to think, Geoffrey, though, I'm 51 years old, it's time I stopped living with felt animals... cartoon house, and got a job, found a place of my own.
Stu, don't be rude. Geoffrey from Rainbow is our guest.
It's all right, Rich. No, I don't mind. I mean, see, the thing is, Stu, I got on so well with the guys.
The hardest one was approaching Rod Hull when we were doing the TV thing, because there'd been like weeks and weeks of Kevin Eldon coming on going, I am Rod Hull for absolutely, I think that's one of my favourite characters that you ever created. He just had a giant chin, a crazy hair and a rubbish emu, he just used to go, I am Rod Hull, and then we had to ask they went, we want Rod Hull. I'm like, thanks, right, okay, I have to make that vocal to the Rod
But he was delighted because we asked him and not emu. So Rod Hull did it because we said we just want you, we don't want Emu.
I forgot that.
And that was part of the reason he did it. And we were very respectful to him. And we did, the Fist Fun Radio thing was just, it was...
It was fun at that stage. That was one of the most fun times in radio, doing stuff on Radio 1 at that time. And because it was kind of more like live DJ-y type show, it was way looser. It wasn't pre-scripted. It wasn't stuff that was like me being a taskmaster going, make this sketch better. It was people turning up and it was late night recordings. And actually a lot of funny things came out of that.
Yeah, and great way to generate material. You know, once we got into the 2 hour, I think they were DJ shows, which was with music, but also some sketches and also just us chatting.
It was interesting because just as it was becoming all rock and roll and Radio 1 on radio, I went into TV, and at that time it was an amazingly kind of retro-y department without anything. All of the cool stuff went to independents. So it was weird. It was like stepping back in time to how radio comedy used to be.
So, yeah, this is the mid-90s, and you see in radio comedy it's transferring over to TV, so not just Fist of Fun, the day-to-day, they think it's all over, Alan Partridge, Room 101.
But all of those were done from outside the BBC's own department. They weren't done in-house. None of that sort of stuff had been done from inside, so it was weird. Me and Johan Magnusson were the first people that had gone across, really, internally and made that move.
Would you say there was a bad reaction when radio people were coming across?
It took a while, in a way, before the department sort of caught up, and then David Lindemann came in and it changed, and and things opened up. But when I first went in there, it was a strange thing, and I wasn't getting an awful lot of interest in the idea of doing Fist of Fun on TV to start with until the department started to change. It took me about 4 months before they would allow me car park tickets.
Anyway, because it's the end of the series, we've been allowed to bring in games.
I have a final question for you. And do you feel that radio comedy, your time there, has had a big influence on what you went on to do?
Oh, I mean, I think definitely, it's just in terms of, the relationships we forged, what we learnt there, it was an amazing time to be through. And I look back fondly, though I'm very depressed through a lot of it. And we did work very hard, but, such fun as well, behind all the hard work, and made good friends. But I don't think British comedy would be completely different with that. I mean, League of Gentlemen, On the Hour, Stuart Lee, all these people who've gone on to sort of define comedy, and without that time at the BBC, I don't think any of us would have. How would you make that leap? It's like now, I think with podcasts, you can make that leap on your own, but then you still have to get an audience, so it's still difficult. I hope there is still stuff going on where people are able to come through in the same way. But
final word, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I've ended up in the kind of animation film world is the same kind of thing about a collegiate thing of comedy people working together. It was a great creative environment to have so many people being given opportunities to do something new in a small environment with each other. That is an absolutely unique kind of way of lighting a fire under a lot of people's talent. The collaboration, the fun of it, even the competitiveness, all of it is a huge, fun, exciting spark to your creativity that drives you forward. And there's no way you get to the same place by being someone that starts a blog when you're 21, is there?
No.
It's those cross-cultural things that have changed it, and, long may that continue as a department.
Thank you very much, Richard Herring and Sarah Smith. That was The Frequency of Laughter, presented by me, Grace Dent, with Richard Herring and Sarah Smith, and Armando Iannucci and Diane Macias. A list of the clips we've used is on the Radio 4 website. The producers were Ed Morrish and Alexandra Smith. That was a podcast from BBC Radio 4. You can discover more about The Frequency of Laughter, including pictures and series highlights, on the Radio 4 website.